Abigail Carter picked up the cast-iron skillet, walked out of the kitchen and set it down on the table in front of 4 men who had just decided her ranch was worth nothing. "Cook for us," one of them said, like he was talking to furniture. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man who has spent his whole life measuring things wrong. "I will," she said, "and when I'm done, you're going to beg to pay 3 times what you just offered." They laughed. She was already walking back to the fire. If this story already has you feeling something, please subscribe to our channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And stay with us all the way to the end, because what Abigail does next is something those men never forgot for the rest of their lives. The summer of 1884 came to Montana like it always did, hot, dry, and indifferent to the struggles of men trying to hold on to land that had never truly been tamed. The Whitaker Ranch sat on a wide stretch of open range north of the Yellowstone River, and from a distance it looked like something a man could be proud of. The fence lines were mostly straight. The barn was solid enough. The cattle moved slowly across the grass in the morning light, the way cattle do when they don't know anything is wrong. But Thomas Whitaker knew. He had known for almost a year that the ranch was dying underneath him, the way a tree rots from the inside before anything on the outside shows it. The debts had piled up quietly, the way debts always do, one bad season turning into 2, one loan becoming 3. Feed costs rising and beef prices dropping, and the bank in Billings sending letters that Thomas read once and then folded very small and pressed to the bottom of his desk drawer, as though keeping them out of sight might keep them from being real. He was 41 years old, and he had spent 20 of those years building this place from a single inherited plot of scrubland into something that fed 30 men and kept 200 head of cattle. And now in the summer of 1884, he was watching it come apart in his hands, the way wet paper does slowly, then all at once. The buyers arrived on a Tuesday. There were 4 of them, and they came from Billings in a wagon that was nicer than anything on the ranch. Thomas watched them from the porch as they climbed down and stretched and looked around with the particular equipment that wealthy men wear when they are already calculating how little they intend to pay for something. They wore clean coats despite the dust. Their boots were new. One of them had a pocket watch he kept checking, as though his time were far too valuable to waste on a failing cattle operation in rural Montana. Their leader was a man named Gerald Forsyth. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad across the chest, with gray at his temples and a way of speaking that made everything he said sound like a final verdict. He had bought and sold cattle operations across 3 territories, and he wore that experience like armor, the absolute unshakable certainty that he knew what things were worth and that his opinion was the only one that mattered. Thomas came down off the porch and shook hands and said all the right things, and Gerald Forsyth smiled with his mouth and not his eyes and said they were happy to take a look at the herd. They walked the fields for less than 40 minutes. Thomas had expected more. He had hoped, foolishly, that men who were serious about buying would take more time, would ask more questions, would look more carefully at animals he knew he believed. Deep in his chest were better than what their rough winter coats and lean frames suggested. It had been a hard season. The cattle looked rougher than they were. A man who knew cattle should have been able to see past that. Gerald Forsyth did not appear to know cattle, or if he did, he chose not to use that knowledge in Thomas's favor. "They're thin," Forsyth said, standing at the fence with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the herd with an expression of mild disappointment. "Undersized for this time of year. The Herefords in the far pasture have decent bone structure, but the others," he shook his head slowly, the way a doctor shakes his head when the news is bad. "I've seen healthier animals come off drought range." It was a hard winter, Thomas said, and he hated how that sounded, thin, apologetic, like an excuse rather than a fact. "Hard winters are part of the business," Forsyth said. One of the other buyers, a younger man named Calhoun who seemed to be there mainly to agree with everything Forsyth said, nodded along, and wrote something in a small notebook. "We can offer you $40 a head," Forsyth said. "For the full herd, 212 animals as counted." Thomas felt the number land somewhere in his stomach. $40. The cattle were worth 80, maybe more, if a man had the patience to wait for the right market or the right season. $40 a head would barely cover what he owed on the property, let alone give him anything to rebuild with. It was the kind of offer you made to a man when you wanted to take something from him, not buy it. "That's not close to fair value," Thomas said. "That's the market," Forsyth replied, without any particular emotion. "Take it now or wait for another buyer who may not come at all." Thomas stood at that fence for a long moment, looking at his cattle, looking at his land, looking at the future he had built with his own hands, and that now seemed to be slipping away from him like smoke and wind. He was trying to find something to hold on to, some argument, some counteroffer, some angle he hadn't considered. He didn't see Abigail standing at the kitchen window. But she saw everything. Abigail Carter had worked at the Whitaker Ranch for 11 years. She had arrived in the spring of 1873, 24 years old, and already experienced in the kind of work that doesn't get noticed: the cooking, the preserving, the daily management of a working household that needed to feed hungry men 3 times a day, regardless of what else was happening on the property. She had learned to cook from her mother, who had learned from her grandmother, women who understood that feeding people well was not a small thing, that food was where knowledge lived if you knew how to read it. She was a large woman. She had always been large, broad-shouldered, thick-waisted, with hands that were strong from years of work, and a face that would have been called handsome if anyone had taken the time to look at it carefully. Most people didn't. Most people looked at Abigail and saw the apron and the kitchen and the steady, reliable competence of someone who would always be there when you needed a meal and would never ask for more than her wages. She was 35 years old, and she had spent 11 years being invisible on a ranch where she knew more about the quality of the cattle than most of the men who tended them. Because Abigail had spent 11 years cooking that beef. She knew these animals in a way that Gerald Forsyth never would. She knew which cuts came from which pastures, which seasons produced the tenderest meat, which feeding conditions built the kind of marbling that melted against your tongue, and which ones gave you something that was technically food, but nothing more than that. She had cooked steaks from ranches across 3 counties, had fed buyers and sellers and bankers and drifters, and she could tell you with absolute certainty that the Whitaker cattle, even coming off a hard winter-produced beef that was exceptional. Not good, exceptional. The kind of beef that told you something true about the land it had come from and the care that had gone into raising it. She had known it for years. She had mentioned it once, gently, to Thomas, 2 summers ago, when a buyer had come through and offered a price she thought was too low. Thomas had thanked her politely and not pursued the conversation further. He was not unkind about it. He simply hadn't thought it was a conversation that needed to continue. She watched Forsyth shake his head at the fence. She watched Thomas's shoulders drop, that particular surrender of a man who is losing an argument he knows he should win but doesn't have the language to fight. She watched Calhoun write in his little notebook with a satisfied expression. And something in Abigail's chest shifted. Not anger. Not exactly. Something older and quieter than anger, the kind of feeling that comes when you have watched something wrong happen one too many times and you finally decide that watching is no longer something you are willing to do. She set down her dish towel. She walked out of the kitchen. She had never walked into a business conversation on this ranch before. It was not the kind of thing a cook did. It was not the kind of thing a woman did. In 1884, in Montana, among men who had already decided what everything was worth. She knew all of that. She walked out anyway. The gravel crunched under her boots as she crossed the yard, and the sound of her approach made Thomas turn around with an expression of confused surprise. and made Forsyth look at her with the particular blankness of a man encountering something he has not factored into his calculations. "Mr. Forsyth," Abigail said. Her voice was level. She had decided, somewhere between the kitchen window and the fence, that she would not be apologetic, and she would not be aggressive, and she would not give any of these men a reason to dismiss her before she had said what she came to say. "My name is Abigail Carter. I've been the cook at this ranch for 11 years. Forsyth looked at her. His expression was polite in the way that a closed door is polite. "Ma'am," he said. "I've cooked beef from this herd for 11 years, Abigail said. Every season, every cut. I've fed buyers and ranchers and working men from here to Billings, and I'm telling you that you are making a mistake." Forsyth's expression did not change. "Is that so?" "The cattle you just dismissed are running lean because of the winter," Abigail said. "The bone structure on those Herefords, you notice that's not a coincidence. That's the land they're raised on, and the way they're managed. A lean animal coming off a hard winter and a poor quality animal are not the same thing, and any man who has spent real time around cattle should know the difference." Calhoun looked up from his notebook with an expression somewhere between amusement and irritation. One of the other buyers shifted his weight and glanced at Forsyth. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am," Forsyth said, in the tone of a man who does not appreciate it at all, "but the assessment has been made." "Then let me prove you're wrong," Abigail said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of men who have been surprised by something they didn't expect and are deciding whether to be amused or offended. Thomas said, very quietly, "Abigail, 1 hour," she said, and she was looking at Forsyth, not at Thomas. "Give me 1 hour in that kitchen. Let me cook the steaks. If I'm wrong about what these cattle are worth, you haven't lost anything. If I'm right, you'll want to rethink that number before you leave this property." Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he looked back at Abigail, and something shifted in his expression, not respect, not yet, but a flicker of something that might have been curiosity. Or might have simply been the calculation of a man who recognized that he had nothing to lose by waiting an hour. "Fine," he said. "Cook your steaks." He said it the way you say something to a child, who is asked to show you a trick indulgent, certain the trick won't amount to much, already preparing the mild praise he would offer before returning to the real business. Abigail turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and she did not look at Thomas's face because she didn't need to. She could feel his uncertainty behind her like weather the way a storm feels before it arrives, pressure dropping, air going still. She had 1 hour. She intended to use every minute of it. Back in the kitchen, Abigail moved with a focused quiet that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with concentration. She had cooked under pressure before 30 hungry men coming in from a cattle drive, a ranch kitchen with 3 failing burners, a dinner for Thomas's banker, that she had produced under conditions that would have broken a less experienced cook. She understood that pressure was not an obstacle to good cooking. It was fuel for it. She chose the cuts herself, going to the cold storage and selecting with the particular deliberateness of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for. She did not choose the easiest cuts. She did not choose the tenderest, most forgiving pieces that would make any cook look competent. She chose the tougher sections, the cuts that required the most skill to coax into excellence, the ones that would expose weakness in poor quality beef and reward quality in good beef with something cooked close to transcendence. She built the fire with care, because heat management was where most people lost the battle before they'd begun. Too hot and you drove all the flavor out, got a surface char that tasted like effort and nothing underneath. Too cool and you were just warming meat, not transforming it. The fire she built was precise, the kind of precise that looks effortless when you've done it 10,000 times, but is anything but effortless the first 100. Her seasoning was her own, had been her own since she was 12 years old, watching her mother work in a kitchen in Virginia, a combination of dried herbs and salt, and something she'd added herself over the years. A small adjustment here and there that she'd never written down and never shared with anyone. The kind of knowledge that lives in your hands and your nose and the particular feeling of rightness when a thing is done correctly. She laid the first steak in the iron and listened to it speak. That was how her mother had always described it. The sizzle told you what the meat was doing. The way it changed as the minutes passed told you where the heat was going. The color told you when to turn. The smell told you when to trust and when to adjust. It was a language that took years to learn, and that you never stopped learning, and Abigail had been speaking it since childhood. 25 steaks. She worked the iron and the fire the way a conductor works an orchestra, not loudly, not with visible effort, but with the complete internal certainty of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and why every choice matters. Outside, she could hear the buyers talking. Their voices drifted through the thin walls of the ranch kitchen, Forsyth's low assured tone, Calhoun's agreement, the occasional low laugh of men who are comfortable in their certainty and have not yet been given reason to question it. She heard Thomas say something she couldn't make out, and then a long silence that told her he was running out of things to say. She turned the steaks. She heard one of the buyers, the quiet one who hadn't spoken much, say something about the billing stockyards and a different operation he'd looked at the previous week. She heard Forsyth say the price he'd offered was generous, given the condition of the herd. She heard the word desperate, and she did not know if they were talking about Thomas or the ranch or both. And she did not let the word touch her, because she had learned long ago that the opinions of men who have already made up their minds are not information, they are just noise. She kept her hands on her work. The kitchen filled with a smell that was difficult to describe to someone who had never experienced not just cooked meat, not just smoke and fat and the sweet char of good seasoning hitting a hot surface, but something deeper than any of those things individually. The smell of quality revealing itself. The smell of something good finally being given the conditions it needed to be understood. She plated 25 steaks with the same care she had given every step before it. She did not put out the usual ranch table settings, tin cups and worn knives, and the practical utilitarian spread of a working meal. She used what the main house had, the good china that Thomas's late wife had brought to Montana, and that sat mostly unused in the cabinet, the silverware that had been a wedding gift, and that Abigail polished once a month whether it was used or not. Out of a respect for fine things that she had always believed deserved to be used rather than preserved. She set the table in the main dining room, which was also mostly unused, and she carried the steaks in herself, one platter at a time, and she set them down without ceremony and then stepped back. "Mr. Forsyth," she said, appearing in the doorway of the porch. "The meal is ready." Forsyth looked at her. Then he looked at his companions. Then he came inside, the others following, and they sat down at the table with the air of men performing a mildly entertaining delay before returning to what they'd already decided. Thomas came in last. He stood at the far end of the table and looked at the spread in front of him, the good china, the silver. The 25 steaks laid out with the care and intention of someone who understood that presentation was not vanity but communication, and something moved through his face that Abigail couldn't quite read. Something between surprise and recognition. She stood against the wall. She did not sit. She was not asked to sit. She stood the way she had always stood in rooms like this, at the edge of things, present but not counted, visible but not seen. She watched Forsyth pick up his fork. She watched him cut into the steak with the expression of a man going through emotion, not expecting the motion to reveal anything. She watched the knife go through the meat, and she watched him pause. The color was perfect. The texture, even from across the room, was unmistakable to anyone who had seen enough beef to know the difference between something merely cooked and something transformed. The interior of that steak spoke in a language that didn't need translation. Forsyth lifted a piece to his mouth. The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of men being considerate. The involuntary quiet of men who have just encountered something they weren't prepared for. Calhoun set down his pen. The quiet buyer looked up from his plate. The fourth man, who had been leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone waiting for a meal to be finished, sat forward. Gerald Forsythe chewed slowly. He set down his fork. He looked at the steak on his plate with an expression that was almost accusatory, as though the meat had done something to him that he hadn't consented to. Then he looked up at Abigail. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "From my mother," Abigail said. "Same as most things worth knowing." "The seasoning is mine." Forsythe looked back at the steak. He picked up his fork again, cut another piece, ate it with the deliberate focus of a man who is reassessing something important and not yet ready to admit out loud exactly how significant the reassessment is. The other buyers were eating now, and the sounds of the table had changed completely from what they would have been 5 minutes earlier. The casual performative appreciation of men sitting through an obligatory meal had become something else entirely, the focused, slightly urgent attention of people encountering genuine quality. Calhoun cut a piece and held it up to look at it. This is Whitaker beef," he said. "From the pasture you walked this morning," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. A steadiness. "From the animals you called undersized," Abigail said from the wall. Nobody laughed. Nobody told her to be quiet. Forsythe looked at her, and for the first time since she'd walked across that gravel yard and said her piece at the fence, he was looking at her as though she were a person in the room and not a fixture of it. "You've been cooking this beef for 11 years, he said. "Every season," Abigail said. "Every cut. I know what these animals produce, and I know what that's worth. I knew your offer was wrong before you finished making it." Forsythe set his fork down completely. He pushed back slightly from the table and clasped his hands together and looked at Thomas Whitaker with an expression that had shed every trace of the easy confidence he'd arrived with. "The offer," Forsythe said, "was a mistake." Thomas said nothing. "The herd is not what I assessed it to be." Forsythe said the words the way men say things they've had to force themselves to say, not easily, not with grace, but with the particular grim honesty of a professional who understands that getting it wrong matters. "I need to reconsider the numbers." The 4 buyers stepped outside onto the porch, and their voices dropped into the murmur of men in serious private conversation, and Thomas stood in the dining room and looked at the food on the table and then at Abigail. And for a long moment neither of them said anything. "I didn't know," Thomas said finally. "I know you didn't," Abigail said. "You should have." He stopped. Started again. "You tried to tell me before." 2 summers ago. I did." He looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her before, the way people look at someone they know so well they've stopped seeing them. He looked at her the way Forsythe had just looked at that steak, with the dawning recognition of someone who has been in the presence of something valuable for a long time, without understanding its nature. "Abigail," he said, "whatever they come back in here with, I want you to know." "Let's hear their number first," she said. "Then we can talk." Outside on the porch, Forsythe's voice rose slightly. Then fell. Then there was a long silence. Then the door opened. Forsythe came back in first, and he came in differently than he'd left, not with the certainty of a man about to collect something cheap, but with the posture of a man who is entering a negotiation that has become, against his expectations, real. $75 a head, he said. Thomas's breath shifted audibly. Calhoun spoke before Forsythe could continue. "I'd go to 80, he said, and there was a competitive edge in his voice now, the tone of a man who has remembered that he has the ability to disagree with the person he'd been agreeing with all day. 82, the quiet buyer said. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. It was the most words he'd said all day. Forsythe looked at Thomas. 85, he said. Thomas turned to Abigail. She looked back at him steadily. 90, Thomas said. The silence stretched. Done, Forsythe said. The number was more than double the original offer. It was nearly triple what they'd walked in that morning intending to pay. 212 head at $90 each was a figure that would not just save the ranch, it would give Thomas room to rebuild, room to grow. room to stop folding letters and pressing them to the bottom of a drawer because he couldn't bear to read them twice. Thomas knew it. And Abigail, standing against the wall of the dining room that she had set and served and cleaned for 11 years, knew it too. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that the conversation that was about to happen after Forsyth and his buyers climbed back into their clean wagon and headed south toward Billings was going to be the most important conversation she had ever had in 11 years on this ranch. And it was going to change everything, not just the price of the cattle. Everything. The wagon was barely out of sight when Thomas Whitaker turned to Abigail and said the words she had never heard in 11 years of working on this ranch. "Tell me what you need. Not thank you. Not well done." Not the polite distancing praise of an employer acknowledging a good meal. He said, "Tell me what you need," and he said it the way a man speaks when he has just realized he has been standing on top of something valuable without knowing it, and the realization has unsettled him down to his foundation. Abigail dried her hands on her apron. She had already started clearing the good china, because that was what she did. She cooked. She served. She cleared. She moved on to the next task. 11 years of that rhythm was hard to break even when the moment called for something different. "Right now," she said, "I need to get these plates back in the cabinet before they get chipped." "Abigail." She set the stack down on the sideboard and turned to face him. Thomas Whitaker was not a man who showed much on his face. He had the particular weathered restraint of someone who had spent decades dealing with drought and debt and the daily disappointments of ranch life, by simply continuing to function, keeping the expression level, keeping the voice steady, keeping the machinery of forward motion going, because stopping was not something the work allowed. But standing in that dining room, with the smell of those steaks still in the air and $90 ahead, sitting in a handshake agreement he hadn't imagined, when he'd woken up that morning, the restraint had cracked slightly. He looked tired in a different way than usual. Not the physical exhaustion of ranch work, but the deeper tiredness of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long, and has just been reminded that he didn't have to. "I've been wrong about a number of things," he said. "Yes," Abigail said. He blinked. He had expected her to be more gracious about it, she could tell. To soften it, to offer him the easy comfort of, "No, you weren't wrong, you just didn't know." She didn't offer him that because it wasn't true, and one of the few luxuries she had decided to allow herself after 11 years of invisibility was the luxury of not saying things that weren't true. "2 summers ago," he said, "when you told me the buyer's price was too low. You thanked me and changed the subject. I did." "I know you did." Thomas moved to the chair at the head of the table and sat down, which was unusual. He was not a man who sat in the middle of the day. He said, "If I'd listened then, you would have gotten a better price 2 summers ago." Abigail said, "And we wouldn't be having this conversation now." "But we are having it, and I'd rather talk about what comes next than what should have happened before." He looked at her for a long moment. What does come next? Abigail had thought about this. Not today, she had not had time to think today, had only had time to act, to move from the kitchen window to the yard, to the fire, to the platter, to the wall of the dining room in a straight line of necessary motion. But she had thought about it before, in the quiet way that people who are excluded from decisions think about what those decisions should be privately, carefully, without any particular expectation that the thinking would lead to anything. "The herd," she said. "You need to stop selling at the first price that comes through the door. What Forsyth offered you this morning was not a market price. It was a pressure price, what a man offers when he believes you're desperate enough to accept it. You are going to get that offer again from other buyers, as long as you continue to look desperate." "And how do I stop looking desperate when I am desperate?" "By knowing what you have," Abigail said. "By being able to demonstrate it. By not letting men walk your fields for 40 minutes and then set the terms." Thomas was quiet. "The quality is in the beef," she continued. "It's in the land and how you're running it. But no buyer sees that standing at a fence looking at lean animals in the summer. They see it when they eat the meat. which means the demonstration has to be part of the sale. You're saying I should feed every buyer who comes through. I'm saying you should give your product the chance to speak for itself instead of letting other men do the speaking. Thomas rubbed a hand across his jaw. Outside, one of the ranch hands was calling to another ordinary afternoon sounds. The work of the ranch continuing with no knowledge of what had just shifted inside the main house. And who, Thomas said slowly, would manage that? The demonstrations. The cooking. The presentation. Abigail looked at him steadily. That would depend on what you're asking me. He understood her. She could see that he understood her, and she watched him work through it in real time, the assumptions and the habits of 11 years, sitting on one side of the scale and the memory of $90 ahead, and Gerald Forsyth's expression when he first cut into that steak, sitting on the other. I want to offer you a partnership, Thomas said. A real one. Formal. Written. Abigail's expression didn't change, because she had learned a long time ago not to let her expression change when she was surprised. Since the surprise was often a trap, the moment you showed someone they had caught you off guard, the moment remembered they had power over you. A partnership in what exactly, she said. In the ranch. In decisions about the herd, the sales, the way we present ourselves to buyers. You understand this operation better than I've given you credit for. Better than I've allowed you to demonstrate. He stopped. Then he said something that cost him something. She could tell by the way he said it. Better than me in some things. In most things relating to the quality of what we produce, Abigail said calmly. Yes. He didn't flinch. Yes, in most of those things. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was undecided. She had been thinking about something like this conversation for years, without ever expecting it to happen, but because she understood that the terms mattered more than the offer. And that the way she responded to this moment would set the terms for everything that followed. I want it written, she said. Not a handshake, not an understanding, not a gentleman's agreement that exists only as long as you feel grateful about what happened today. Written. Legal with my name on it. I'll contact the lawyer in Billings. I want a percentage of the proceeds from every sale I have a hand in. Not a wage increase. Thomas nodded slowly. That's fair. I want to be in the room when buyers come. Not in the kitchen waiting to be useful. In the room, from the beginning. All right. And I want it understood, she paused. Not for drama. Because she needed to choose the words precisely. I want it understood that when I speak about this ranch and this herd and the quality of what we're selling, I am speaking with authority. Not as the cook offering an opinion, as a partner telling a buyer the truth about what they're looking at. That understanding needs to be communicated from you to anyone who comes through that gate. If it isn't, the partnership doesn't function. Thomas Whitaker looked at Abigail Carter across the dining room table with the good china stacked on the sideboard and the afternoon light coming through the window and the smell of 25 perfectly cooked steak still present in the room like evidence. Agreed, he said. She nodded once. She picked up the stack of plates and carried them back to the cabinet and put them away with care, because they deserved care. And then she went back to the kitchen to begin preparing the evening meal because 30 men still needed to eat, and the work didn't stop because the world had shifted. But it had shifted, and Abigail felt it the way you feel a change in weather, not in any single dramatic sensation, but in the pressure of everything around you rearranging itself into a new configuration. She didn't know yet how hard that rearrangement was going to be. The written agreement arrived from Billings 12 days later. Thomas signed it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, with Abigail standing across from him, and when the lawyer a dry. Careful man named Aldous Pemberton, who had ridden out from the city specifically for this purpose, and who had asked Thomas 3 times, in 3 different ways, whether he was certain about the arrangement, finally stopped asking and handed the pen to Abigail. She signed her name in the clear, deliberate cursive of a woman who has been waiting a long time to write it somewhere that mattered. Abigail Carter, partner. The news moved through the ranch the way news always moves through a small community, aptly faster than anyone carried it, slower than anyone expected, and with more distortion than the original fact deserved. By the following morning, every ranch hand knew. By the afternoon, the three families who owned adjacent properties had been informed through the particular telegraph of rural gossip that operates through chance encounters at fence lines and casual conversation at the general store. By Friday, the town of Kellam, 8 miles south on a road that turned to mud in the rain, had a version of the story that bore only partial resemblance to what had actually happened. The version in Kellam was that Thomas Whitaker had given his cook a piece of the ranch. Some people said it was out of pity. Some said it was gratitude gone too far. A few said it was something else entirely, with the particular significant tone of people who prefer implications to accusations. Abigail heard versions of all of it. She heard it from Margaret, the dry goods owner's wife, who came out to the ranch twice a month, and who reported the town's opinion with the cheerful candor of someone who thought Abigail should know what was being said about her. She heard it from two of the ranch hands, separately, in the way that people tell you things they believe they are warning you about. She received the information and she filed it, and she did not let it change what she was doing, because she had expected it. She had known, when she signed her name on that paper, that the agreement would cost her something socially that the work had not. The work, the cooking, the labor, the invisible competence of 11 years had cost her nothing socially, because nobody had noticed it enough to object to it. The moment she became a partner, she became visible, and the moment she became visible, she became a target. She had signed anyway. What she hadn't fully calculated was the speed at which the resistance would organize. It came first through the ranch hands. Not all of them, most of the men who worked the Whitaker property, were practical people who cared more about the quality of the work than the identity of who was overseeing it, and who had eaten Abigail's cooking for long enough to hold her in a particular private regard that they would not have described as respect, but that functioned as such. But three of them led, predictably, by a man named Dale Hutchins, who was the longest-serving hand on the property, and who had his own convictions about how things should operate, and who had the authority to run them, made their position clear within the first week. Dale came to the kitchen on a Thursday morning. He was a tall man, rangy and sun-weathered, with the particular gestures of someone who has been given informal authority for long enough that he has forgotten it is informal. "I need to talk to you," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. Abigail was making biscuits. She did not stop making biscuits. "Then talk," she said. Dale stepped inside. He had the particular discomfort of a man who has prepared a speech and is now finding that the audience isn't behaving according to the expected script. He had expected her to stop what she was doing, to give him her full attention, to respond to the weight of his purpose with appropriate deference. She kept her hands in the dough. "What Thomas did," Dale said, "the arrangement he made with you, I want you to know there are men here who don't agree with it." "There are men everywhere who don't agree with things," Abigail said. "That doesn't make the things wrong. This is a ranch," Dale said. "This is how a ranch operates. There's a chain here. There's a way things work. And when you start changing the structure of how decisions get made, when you start putting women in decision-making positions," Abigail said, filling in the gap he'd left. Dale's jaw tightened. "I was going to say when you change the structure without understanding how things are run from the ground up." "I've been running things from the ground up for 11 years, Abigail said. "I just haven't been getting credit for it. The kitchen isn't the ranch." "The kitchen is what keeps the ranch going," she said. And she set the biscuit dough down on the board and turned to face him with the same level stillness she had used at the fence, with foresight, not aggressive, not defensive, simply present and certain. "Every man on this property eats what I cook. The quality of what they eat affects how they work. The way this household operates affects whether this ranch can attract and keep workers. I know more about what every man on this property needs, physically, to do their job effectively, than most people here, including you. And that's before you get to what I know about the cattle. Dale stared at her. The cattle. I've been cooking Whitaker beef for 11 years, she said. I know this herd. I know what the meat tells you about how the animals are doing, and what the land is doing, and what the season has done to them. I knew Gerald Forsyth's offer was wrong before he finished making it. You didn't. Thomas didn't. Forsyth certainly didn't. You cooked a good steak, Dale said. That doesn't make you a rancher. No, Abigail agreed. But it makes me someone who understood the value of this operation when every man who was supposed to understand it failed to. And that's not nothing, Dale. That's the whole thing. Dale Hutchins looked at her for a long moment. She could see the argument rearranging itself behind his eyes, not collapsing. He was not the kind of man whose positions collapsed, but shifting, finding a new defensive line. The men are unsettled, he said finally. I just need you to know that. I appreciate you telling me directly, Abigail said, and she meant it, because directness was something she could work with. Tell the men that nothing about how this ranch operates day to day is changing because of a piece of paper. They'll still get their meals, their wages, their work assignments, through the same channels they always have. The only thing that's changing is who sits in the room when buyers come through. That's all. Dale didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded the nod of a man accepting a temporary ceasefire and left. Abigail turned back to her biscuits. She had told Dale that the only thing changing was who sat in the room. She had told him that because it was the truth of what she'd agreed to with Thomas, and because it was the simplest version of the truth, and simplicity was useful when you were trying to reduce alarm. But she knew, in the way that she knew things about beef and fire and the turning of seasons, that it was not the whole truth. Because the room was where everything started. The room was where prices got set and terms got decided, and the future of the ranch got shaped, one conversation at a time. And Abigail in the room was not the same as Abigail in the kitchen. Abigail in the room was information being introduced into a system that had never had it before, and the system was going to respond. She had been right that the response would come. What she had underestimated was the particular form it would take. It came 3 weeks into the partnership, in the form of a man named Harold Graves. Graves was not a cattle buyer. He was a land broker, which meant, as Abigail understood it, that he was in the business of facilitating the movement of property from people who owned it to people who wanted to own it. And that his income depended on the gap between what he paid and what he sold for, which meant that his entire professional existence was structured around finding people who could be convinced their land was worth less than it was. He arrived on a Saturday morning without notice, which was the first signal Abigail read correctly, because men who respected the people they were dealing with gave notice. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his late 40s, with the smooth professional courtesy of someone who had learned that friendliness is a tool. Thomas met him on the porch. Abigail, by the terms of their agreement, was called in from the kitchen. She came in drying her hands on her apron, and she watched Harold Graves look at her with the particular rapid assessment of a man who files people according to their usefulness, and had instantly filed her in the wrong category. He extended his hand to Thomas. He did not extend it to Abigail. Miss, he said, with a brief nod in her direction. Mrs. Carter is my partner in this operation, Thomas said. She'll be part of this conversation. Graves's smile didn't falter. Of course, he said, in a tone that meant something different from the words. He sat down in the main room and he unfolded his proposition the way men like him always did, slowly, generously. With a great deal of emphasis on what a rare opportunity this was and how fortunate Thomas was that the opportunity had presented itself at exactly the right moment. The proposition was essentially a purchase offer for the western section of the Whitaker property, 60 acres of prime grazing land that sat along the river and that Graves represented as excess acreage that Thomas could liquidate to relieve his remaining debts. He had done his research. Abigail could see that. He knew about the debt. He knew the numbers closely enough that he had clearly spoken to someone in Billings, the bank, possibly. or someone adjacent to it, and he had constructed his offer around the specific pressure points of Thomas's financial position with the precision of someone who had done this before and done it well. The price he named for the 60 acres was a third of what that land was worth. Abigail said no. Both men looked at her. She had not prefaced it. Had not said "I'm sorry" or "excuse me" or "with respect." She had simply said no, clearly and without apology, the way you say no when no is the correct answer. Graves's smile thinned at the edges. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you have a role here, but this is really a matter between." "Mr. Graves," Abigail said, "the 60 acres you're describing carries the river access for the entire east pasture. Without that access, the grazing value of the remaining property drops by approximately 40%. Which means that if Thomas sold that land at your price, he would not only receive a fraction of its actual worth, he would simultaneously reduce the value of everything he kept. The debt this sale is meant to relieve would be replaced almost immediately by the operational deficit created by losing that grazing access." Graves stared at her. "The land isn't excess," she said. "It's structural, and the price you've named isn't a market price. It's what you'd offer someone who didn't know that." The silence in the room was of a different quality than the silence at the dining table 3 weeks earlier. That silence had been the silence of men surprised by excellent food. This silence was the silence of a man who has been caught. Graves set his papers flat on his knees and looked at Thomas. "I've dealt with a great many ranch operations," he said, "and in my experience." "In your experience," Abigail said, "you deal with people under financial pressure who don't have complete information about what they own." "We have the information. The answer is no." Graves left 30 minutes later, considerably less smooth than he'd arrived. When the door closed, Thomas turned to Abigail. "How did you know about the grazing access dependency?" "Because I know this land," she said simply. "I've been here 11 years. I've watched the cattle move between pastures. I know which ground they prefer in which season and why. The river access isn't a convenience. It's the system." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He knew about the debt. Yes, which means someone told him. Abigail had been thinking about that from the moment Graves had said his numbers too specific to be guesswork. "Yes," she said again. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a problem. It's the beginning of a problem," Abigail said. "It means someone wants this land, and they're not going to stop sending people through that door till they get it or until we become too much trouble to keep approaching." Thomas looked at her. "What do we do?" "We find out who," Abigail said. "And then we make sure they understand that this ranch is not available. Not at any price that doesn't reflect what it's actually worth." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because certainty was what the moment required. But she had read the situation correctly and she knew it. The real fight had not been with Gerald Forsyth. That had been a single negotiation, a demonstration, a morning's work that had changed a number and sent a wagon south. What was coming was something larger. Someone out there had already decided they wanted the Whitaker land. And they were considerably more patient than a cattle buyer checking his pocket watch. The name came from an unlikely source. It was Margaret Holt, the dry goods wife, the cheerful carrier of town opinion, who let it slip on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after Harold Graves had driven away with his papers and his thin smile. Margaret had come out to the ranch to drop off a flower order, which she did not need to deliver personally, but did anyway, because Margaret Holt was constitutionally incapable of passing up an opportunity to be present where things were happening. She had a gift for being in rooms where information was moving, and she exercised it without apology. She was sitting at Abigail's kitchen table, drinking coffee when she said, as though it were something she was mentioning between more important things, "I heard Warren Colt was asking about the Whitaker property over at the land office last month." Abigail set her cup down. "The older one." "Warren. The one who bought the Hendricks place 2 years back and then sold it to the railroad." Margaret stirred her coffee. "He's been buying up everything along the river corridor for the past 18 months. People say he's got a contract with one of the mining interests out of Helena that needs the water access. They're not telling people that directly, obviously. They're telling people it's for agricultural expansion. But it's the water. It's always the water, Margaret said, with the serene certainty of a woman who had lived in Montana long enough to understand what the land was really about. Warren Colt. Abigail turned the name over carefully. She knew it the way she knew most names in that county from a distance, through the accounts of others, through the occasional piece of information that drifted into the kitchen, the way information drifted into kitchens on working ranches, where the hired help heard things the owners never thought to share. Warren Colt was not the kind of man who came through front doors himself. He was the kind of man who sent Harold Graves, she told Thomas that evening. Thomas's reaction was immediate and physical. She watched his shoulders go rigid. Watched the particular tension move through him that comes when a vague threat becomes a specific one, and suddenly has a name and a face and a history you can measure yourself against. Colt bought the Hendricks place, Thomas said. For less than half what it was worth, Abigail said. The Hendricks family was in debt. They were approached repeatedly over a period of about 8 months. Different buyers, different offers, all of them low. By the time Colt made his final offer, old man Hendricks was exhausted and afraid, and he took it because he didn't know what else to do. Thomas stared at her. How do you know all of that? I listened, Abigail said simply. For 11 years I have been in a kitchen that men walk through when they have things on their minds, and I have listened. People talk in front of cooks. They talk in front of women they don't think are paying attention. I have been paying attention since 1873. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He's going to keep sending people until he gets the land or decides we're too complicated to keep pursuing. Which means our job is to become as complicated as possible, as fast as possible. How? Abigail had been thinking about this since Margaret left. We need the community to know what we know, she said. Not just that someone is trying to pressure us, that's our problem. People don't organize around someone else's problem. But if Colt is buying up the river corridor for mining water access, every ranch along that river has the same problem we do. They just don't know it yet. Thomas worked through this slowly, the way he worked through things that required him to move in a direction he hadn't planned for. You want to tell the neighbors. I want to call a meeting, Abigail said. The Pearsons, the McAllisters, the Duval family, the Whitfields. Everyone with property along the Yellowstone corridor who might be next on Colt's list. That's Abigail. That's 7 families. Some of them I haven't spoken to in years. Then it's past time, she said. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize in the weeks since the agreement, the look of a man recalibrating. Adjusting to the reality that the partnership he'd offered to a woman he'd seen primarily as a cook had turned out to include a mind that moved faster than his own in certain territories. All right, he said. Set the meeting. She set it for the following Saturday. She wrote the letters herself, 7 of them, each one specific to the family receiving it, not a form letter, not a general call, but a precise, careful communication that said enough to bring people in without saying so much that the information could be carried back to Colt before the meeting happened. She had Thomas sign them, because his name on the letterhead carried the authority that hers, not yet known in this context, could not. She did not think about what that cost her. There was work to be done, and she was doing it. 6 of the 7 families came. They gathered in the Whitaker main room on a gray Saturday afternoon, ranchers and their wives, and in 2 cases grown sons who worked the land alongside their parents, and the room held more people than it had seen in years. Abigail served coffee and did not sit down, because she understood that her role in this first meeting was to be the person who had called them together, not the person who dominated the room that would come. But not yet, not before she had read how the room worked. Thomas opened. He explained what had happened with Graves. He explained carefully what Margaret had told Abigail about Colt's activities along the river corridor. The room went quiet in a way that was not shock but recognition. She could see it on their faces, the slight shifting of expression that happens when people hear a thing they have been half-sensing but hadn't yet named. Howard Pearson, a big quiet man who ran cattle on 400 acres north of the Whitaker property, spoke first. Graves came to us in June, he said. Offered us a price for the east section. I thought it was just, he stopped. I thought it was just a buyer. He came to us in May, said Ellen McAllister, who had come without her husband and who sat very straight in her chair with the particular alertness of a woman accustomed to being underestimated in rooms like this. We said no. But my husband didn't tell me why Graves had our debt numbers. Her voice was controlled. Now I understand. The room began to move. One by one, the pieces came out: the visits, the offers, the specificity of numbers that should not have been available to a land broker with no direct connection to their finances. The pattern was clear when you laid the pieces beside each other. Individually, each family had experienced a peculiar but explicable approach. Together, the experiences described a coordinated campaign. Abigail let the room talk for 20 minutes. She refilled cups, and she listened, and she mapped the information: who had been approached, when, for which parcels, at what prices, because that map was going to be important. Then she stepped into the center of the room. Not loudly. She didn't need loudness. She said, "May I?" And the room turned to her, and she said what she had organized in her mind over the previous week with the same precision she applied to a fire under an iron skillet. She laid out what she knew: Colt's history with the Hendricks property, the timing of the approaches across multiple ranches, the consistent undervaluation of river access land specifically, the mining interest connection that Margaret had reported, and that, in the days since, Abigail had carefully corroborated through 2 additional conversations with people who would know. She told them what this meant: that the river corridor properties were being systematically targeted because someone had already made a deal for the water access that those properties controlled, and that the buying campaign was designed to complete before anyone understood what was happening. She told them what they could do about it. The room was very still. Ellen McAllister said, "How do you know all of this?" "I've been listening to what passes through this county for 11 years, Abigail said, "and I've been thinking carefully for the past 3 weeks. Ellen looked at her not with the polite dismissiveness that most people applied to Abigail in the first moments of encountering her in this context, but with the direct appraisal of one capable woman recognizing another. "What do you propose we do?" "First, we stop taking individual meetings with anyone connected to Colt," Abigail said. "Anyone who comes to your door with a land offer, in the next 6 months you send them here. To me, no individual negotiations. We handle it collectively, which means the pressure that works on a single family under debt stress doesn't work on 7 families standing together." Howard Pearson nodded slowly. "Second, we get the legal situation documented. Every approach, every offer, every piece of information a broker had about your finances that he shouldn't have had. Written down, dated, signed. I know a lawyer in Billings." She meant Aldous Pemberton, the dry, careful man who had drawn up her partnership paper. "He needs to see the pattern before Colt makes his next move." "And third," Abigail said, "we find out who at the bank has been sharing financial information with Colt's people. Because that's the mechanism. Someone with access to the loan records is telling Colt exactly how much pressure each family is under and what offer will look appealing enough to accept. Without that information, he's operating blind. With it, he's been picking people off one by one." The silence that followed was of a different weight from the earlier quiet, not the silence of recognition, but the silence of people understanding that the problem is larger and closer than they had realized. Then Howard Pearson said, "You figured all of this out from a kitchen." It was not said unkindly. It was said with the genuine puzzlement of a man updating a belief he had held without examination. "I figured most of it out from a kitchen," Abigail said. "The rest I figured out from that room." She indicated the dining room, where Gerald Forsyth and his buyers had sat with good china and silver and 25 steaks. Turns out when you give people something worth paying attention to, they talk freely. People talk most freely when they're comfortable. My job for 11 years has been making people comfortable. I've learned a great deal. Howard Pearson looked at Thomas. Then he looked back at Abigail. Then he said, with the simple decisiveness of a man who makes up his mind and doesn't revisit it, all right. What do you need from us? What she needed was documentation, which the families began assembling over the following 2 weeks, and communication, which she managed through a series of careful conversations that she coordinated from the ranch kitchen with the same organized attention she brought to feeding 30 men on schedule. She was building something not loudly, not visibly from the outside, but with the determined internal architecture of a woman who understood that the foundation had to be solid before any of the visible structure could stand. Dale Hutchins saw some of it. He was not a man who missed things that happened on his ranch, even when those things happened in rooms he didn't enter. He watched Abigail receive letters and write letters and have conversations on the porch with people who came from neighboring properties, and he watched her sit at the table with Thomas in the evenings going over numbers and maps. And something in his expression shifted gradually during those weeks, not from hostility to acceptance, but from certainty to something more complicated. He came to the kitchen again on a Wednesday. This time he didn't stand in the doorway. He came in and sat down, which was different. Someone's been talking to Colt's people from inside the county, he said. I've been hearing things. Abigail set down what she was doing. What kind of things? Duval's boy works at the bank in Kellam, Dale said. Not the Billings Bank, the small one. He says a man came through twice in the past 2 months asking questions about land holdings. Asking in a way that was more specific than a general inquiry. He paused. The man's name was Calhoun. Abigail felt the word land with a weight she had not expected. Calhoun, the young man with the notebook who had sat beside Forsyth at her dining room table and written things down with a satisfied expression. The buyer who had been the first to offer a competing bid when the room turned, the one who had said I'd go to 80 with the competitive edge of a man who enjoyed the game more than the outcome. He had not been a buyer. He had been, from the beginning, Colt's man in the room. Watching, writing down what he saw and heard. The original visit from Forsyth had not been random. He was here, Abigail said. Dale looked at her. What? Calhoun was here in July. He came with Forsyth's group. She said it steadily, working through the implications as she spoke. He sat at my table and ate the food I cooked, and he watched the negotiation and he wrote everything down. He knew Thomas's financial position before he walked in. He saw the quality of the beef when I demonstrated it. He knew what he was looking at when that offer tripled. She stopped. He told Colt. Dale's expression had changed completely. The last of his comfortable certainty was gone, replaced by something more alert. So Colt knows the cattle are more valuable than the original assessment. Yes, which means he knows the land is worth more than Graves offered. Yes, which means Dale stopped. Which means the land offer was never serious, Abigail said. It was information gathering. He wanted to know whether we understood what we had. Graves came to find out if we'd take a bad offer, which would tell him we didn't know the land's full value. We didn't take it, which told him we did. She felt the clarity of the picture settling into focus, the way a fire settles when you've built it correctly. He's not going to send another broker. He knows that won't work now. He's going to try something else, Dale said slowly. What else would he try? Abigail thought about what she knew of Warren Colt. The Hendricks family, exhausted and afraid. The systematic targeting. The patience of 18 months of coordinated pressure. A man like that didn't stop when one approach failed. He adjusted. The debt, she said. It always comes back to the debt. If he can accelerate the repayment pressure, get the Billings Bank to call in the loan early, trigger a default, then the Nyanzika forced sale, regardless of what we know or don't know about its value. Can he do that? He can try, Abigail said. He needs someone at the bank to cooperate, which means the question isn't whether it's coming. It's how fast, and whether we can get the documentation to Pemberton in Billings before the pressure arrives. She was already moving toward the writing desk before she finished the sentence. She had 3 letters to write, and they needed to go out on the morning stage. Dale watched her. "What can I do?" he said. The question landed differently than any version of that question she had heard from Dale Hutchins before. Not skeptical, not territorial, not the careful neutrality of a man tolerating an arrangement he disapproved of. He said, "What can I do?" the way people say it when they have decided which side of something they are on. Abigail looked up from the writing desk. "Ride to the Pearson place this afternoon. Tell Howard we need to move the timeline up. Tell him to get whatever documentation he has to me by Friday." "Done," Dale said, and he was out of the kitchen in under a minute, which was the fastest she had ever seen him move toward anything she had initiated. She wrote the letters. The first went to Aldous Pemberton in Billings, a careful, factual summary of everything she had assembled, with names, dates, and dollar amounts, and a clear request for advice on the legal mechanisms available if the bank moved to accelerate the loan. The second went to a woman named Clara Duval, whose son worked at the Kellum Bank, and who had been at the Saturday meeting, and who had the sharp, quiet intelligence of someone who missed very little. She asked Clara specific questions about Calhoun's visits and specific requests about what her son might have observed. The third letter was the hardest. She addressed it to the president of the Billings Bank, a man named Obadiah Marsh, whom she had never met and who had no reason to give her letter any more attention than he would give any letter from a woman he didn't know in a county he visited once a year. She wrote it anyway, carefully, with the controlled precision of someone who understands that the first impression of a letter is the letter itself, and that every word either earns the next one or loses it. She told him what she believed was being coordinated. She told him the names and the pattern and the documented evidence she was assembling. She told him that if the bank had been used as a conduit for Colt's information gathering, the bank's reputation for discretion was already compromised whether they knew it or not, and that the professional and legal implications of that would be significantly worse if the pattern was eventually exposed rather than addressed proactively. She signed it, Abigail Carter, partner, Whitaker Ranch and Cattle Operation. She sealed all 3 envelopes and she set them on the corner of the desk, and she went back to the kitchen because the evening meal still needed to be made. She was rolling out the pastry for a meat pie when Thomas came in and stopped at the sight of her, not surprised to find her in the kitchen, but surprised by something in her posture. Some quality of the silence around her that communicated what was happening in her mind. "What's happened?" he said. She told him about Calhoun. She told him methodically, the way she was learning to tell Thomas things completely, with the evidence presented before the conclusion. Because he was the kind of man who trusted a case built the bottom up, more than one delivered from the top down. When she finished, Thomas sat down at the kitchen table. He had the expression of a man looking at a painting and suddenly seeing the subject differently, not the picture changing, but his own perception of it shifting. "He was here," Thomas said. "He sat at our table." "He did, and I thanked Forsyth's group. I shook their hands." He stopped. I shook his hand. "You didn't know," Abigail said. "You didn't know either," she said, "but I know now. And the knowing is what matters." Thomas was quiet for a long time. The pastry under Abigail's hands was smooth and even, and she worked it with the automatic competence of decades while her mind held the letters on the corner of the desk and the meeting on Saturday and Dale's boots on the porch steps heading toward the Pearson place and the whole constructed architecture of what she was building quietly, from the ground up, with the same patience and precision she had always brought to every task that mattered. "Abigail," Thomas said. She looked up. "Are we going to be all right?" She held his gaze. She thought about the letters, the community. Dale's unexpected "what can I do?" The documentation assembling itself across 7 ranch properties like pieces of a case that was becoming, slowly and with effort, something solid enough to stand on. She thought about Colt, patient and resourceful, and already adjusting his approach. She thought about what it had taken to get from the kitchen window in July to this kitchen table in September, and what it was going to take to get from here to wherever the end of this was. "We're going to fight," she said. "Whether we're all right depends on how hard and how smart. But we're going to fight." Thomas nodded. It was not a comfortable nod. It was the nod of a man accepting a true answer instead of an easy one, which was, Abigail had decided, the most reliable thing about Thomas Whitaker. He could take the truth when it was given to him straight. She was going to need that, because the letter she had written to Obadiah Marsh at the Billings Bank was going to arrive on his desk in 4 days. And she had absolutely no way of knowing whose side he was on. Obadiah Marsh's reply arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Abigail had sealed her letter and sent it south on the morning stage. She knew it was his reply before she opened it, because it came in an envelope heavier than correspondence usually warranted, the kind of envelope that communicates, before you break the seal, that the person who sent it took the communication seriously. She stood at the kitchen table and held it for a moment, aware that whatever was inside was going to determine the shape of the next several weeks. She opened it. Marsh wrote the way she imagined he did everything precisely, without excess, each sentence doing exactly the work it was assigned and nothing more. He confirmed that he had received her letter. He confirmed that the information she had provided was of concern to the institution. He said, in language careful enough that she read it 3 times to be certain she had it right, that he had reason to believe her account was consistent with patterns of inquiry that had come to his attention through internal channels. Someone inside his bank had been talking to Colt's people. He knew it. And then the sentence that mattered most: he was prepared to discuss this matter in person, and could be in Kellam within the fortnight if she would advise him of a suitable meeting place. She read the letter twice more, then set it on the desk and went to find Thomas. He was at the far fence line, and she walked to him directly, not stopping for a coat even though the October air had gone sharp, because the letter was the kind of thing that didn't wait. "Marsh knows," she said when she reached him. Thomas turned from the fence. He responded, "He wants to meet. 2 weeks. He's coming to Kellam." Thomas stared at her. "He's coming here. The president of the Billings Bank is traveling to a rural county to discuss a problem his institution has with a land broker and a cattle rancher," Abigail said. "That tells you how serious it is. He's not doing this out of professional courtesy. He's doing it because if what I described in that letter becomes public before he addresses it, his bank's reputation takes damage he can't undo. So we're useful to him. We're useful to each other," Abigail corrected. "Which is the best position to negotiate from. We have the documentation. He has the institutional authority to act on it. Neither of us has what the other has." Thomas was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the grass and moved between them. "What do you need?" "Everything we've assembled from the other families needs to be organized before he arrives. Every date, every offer, every number that a broker shouldn't have known. Pemberton needs to be there when we meet Marsh. I want a lawyer present when we're talking to a banker about legal exposure. Pemberton will come. I'll write him today. And the meeting place shouldn't be the ranch," Abigail said. "Neutral ground. I was thinking Ellen McAllister's dining room. She's 2 miles outside Kellam. She's been targeted same as us, and she won't be intimidated by a man from Billings in a good coat." Thomas almost smiled. "No, she certainly won't." Abigail wrote to Ellen that afternoon. Ellen replied within 24 hours, 2 words at the bottom of a brief note: "Obviously, yes." What neither of them had accounted for was Warren Colt. She learned, 4 days before the scheduled meeting with Marsh, that Colt had been in Kellam. Not personally, Colt was never personally in places where things could be observed and reported. But his man Calhoun had been, according to Clara Duval, who sent a note that arrived on a Monday with her son's careful handwriting and her own appended at the bottom. Terse and specific. Calhoun came into the bank Friday. Asked for access to the Whitaker account records. Was told access required authorization. Left without it. Mother says watch your back. Abigail read the note at the kitchen table with a feeling that was not fear but was adjacent to it, the heightened alertness of someone who has been moving carefully and has just realized the other party has been watching the movement. Colt knew something was happening. He didn't know what, or not all of it, but he knew the pattern he had established was disrupted. Graves had failed. Calhoun's banking approach had been blocked. The individual families were not taking individual meetings. Something had organized against him, and he was trying to understand what before, the whatever it was became too structured to dismantle. She had 4 days. She wrote 3 letters that afternoon to Pemberton, to Ellen, and to Howard Pearson, and she changed the meeting time from Saturday afternoon to Friday morning, moving it by 24 hours on the theory that if Colt had sources in Kellam who were watching for scheduled meetings between their targets, an earlier than expected gathering would arrive before the information could travel. Then she went to find Dale. Dale Hutchins had been a different man since the afternoon he'd come into the kitchen and asked, "What can I do?" It wasn't transformation, he was still essentially himself, still rangy and certain, and inclined toward the established order of things, but a seam had developed in his certainty, and through that seam something more useful had grown. He listened differently. He asked questions instead of making declaration. He had ridden to the Pearson place without complaint and had come back with Howard's documentation and a report on the mood of the neighboring properties that was more nuanced and more accurate than anything Abigail had expected. She found him at the barn and told him what Clara's note had said. Calhoun tried to access the account records, Dale repeated. Friday, 4 days ago. Dale thought about this with the deliberate focus of a man who has spent decades reading practical situations. He's trying to find out how much time they have, if the loan's being serviced, how current the payments are, whether there's an opening to push. That's what I think, Abigail said. Are the payments current? Thomas made the October payment on the 1st, Abigail said. We're current, but current doesn't protect you if the bank decides to renegotiate the terms. If Colt has enough influence with the right person at the institution. Marsh, Dale said. If Marsh is with Colt instead of against him, the letter I sent could have told Colt exactly what we know and who we've been talking to. Dale looked at her steadily. Do you think Marsh is with Colt? Abigail had turned this question over for 9 days, since the letter arrived. She had read Marsh's reply until she had it nearly memorized, testing every phrase for the particular slippers of language it used to mislead while remaining technically accurate. No, she said finally. I think Marsh is angry. I think someone in his institution has been compromising his bank's confidentiality and his reputation, and he doesn't like it. But I could be wrong, which is why Pemberton will be in that room. Dale nodded. What do you need me to do? I need 2 things, she said. I need you to ride tonight to the McAllister place and tell Ellen the meeting is Friday morning instead of Saturday afternoon. Don't send a letter. Go in person and tell her directly. And the second thing? I need you to be at that meeting, Abigail said. Not because I need your help in the room. Because when Marsh looks around that table and sees who assembled this coalition, I want him to see that it includes the ranch foreman who has worked this land for 15 years. It tells him something about the seriousness of what we're presenting that no document alone can tell him. Dale was quiet. She watched him absorb the fact that she had just asked him to be present, not assemble, but his credibility had assessed him accurately enough to know what he was worth in that specific context, and had asked for exactly that thing. I'll ride tonight, he said. Friday arrived cold and clear, the kind of fall morning in Montana that feels like a held breath before the weather turns serious. Abigail was up before the sun. She had the ranch hand's breakfast done and cleared before 6, and she was in the wagon by 1:30 with the documentation, every letter, every dated record, every signed account from every family, organized by date and cross-referenced by broker in a leather satchel that Thomas had given her for the purpose. Thomas drove. Abigail sat beside him and did not speak much, because the morning felt like a thing that should not be cluttered with unnecessary words. And because she was running through what she would say to Marsh in the same methodical way, she organized a kitchen before a difficult meal. Everything in the right place, the sequence planned, the adjustments already anticipated. Pemberton was waiting at Ellen's dining room when they arrived. He had ridden from Billings the day before and spent the night at the Kellam boarding house, and he had the slightly compressed alertness of a man who has been briefed on a situation and finds it more complex than the briefing suggested. Ellen McAllister greeted them at the door with coffee and no small talk, which Abigail appreciated. Howard Pearson arrived 10 minutes later with 2 other ranchers from the Community Coalition, Henry Whitfield, and a quiet, precise man named James Okafor, who owned 80 acres north of the Pearson property and who had been approached by Graves in August with an offer so low it had made his wife cry. Marsh arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. He was not what Abigail had constructed in her mind from his letter. She had expected someone older, more institutional in his bearing, the particular stiffness of a man who has spent decades being deferred to. Marsh was somewhere in his mid-50s, trim and observant, with the quality of someone who had built his professional reputation on reading rooms accurately. He came in, shook hands with each person present, and didn't treat Abigail's hand differently from the men's held at the same length of time, met her eyes with the same directness. He sat down across from her. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "your letter was the most precisely written communication I have received from a private individual in 20 years of banking." "I needed you to take it seriously," Abigail said. "I did," he said. "Shall we begin?" What followed was 3 hours of the most concentrated conversation Abigail had ever participated in. Marsh had come prepared. He had his own documentation, internal records he had pulled after receiving her letter, a pattern of information requests made to his institution over the previous 14 months that mapped almost perfectly onto the timeline of Colt's buying campaign. Someone at his Billings branch had been providing property holder financial data to an intermediary whose connection to Colt's operation Marsh had traced but not yet fully documented. The name of the intermediary stopped everyone in the room. It was not someone from the bank. It was a man named Frederick Alderman, who served as the county land recorder in Kellam, a public office that gave him access to deed records, mortgage documentation, and the general financial architecture of land holdings across the entire county. He had been receiving payments from Colt's operation for 14 months. The payments had gone through a business entity in Helena that appeared on its surface to be an agricultural equipment supplier. James Okafor said very quietly, "My wife's father was on the county records board that appointed Alderman." Nobody said anything for a moment. "Is your father-in-law still on the board?" Pemberton asked. "He is," Okafor said. Pemberton looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. The same thought was moving through both of them, the particular calculation of people who have been building a case and have just found a piece that changes the shape of everything. An appointed official receiving payments from a private land interest to facilitate the targeting of property holders. That was not a civil matter. That was not a negotiation. That was a crime, documented across 14 months, with records sitting in a leather satchel on Ellen McAllister's dining room table. "How quickly," Abigail said to Pemberton, "can you formalize what we have here into something a territorial judge would review?" 2 weeks, Pemberton said, "if I have access to Marsh's internal documentation as supporting material." All eyes went to Marsh. Marsh looked at the table for a moment. He was doing the calculation that Abigail had anticipated. He would need to do, weighing the institutional exposure of cooperation against the institutional exposure of non-cooperation, working through the reputational architecture of a decision that had no clean options, only better and worse ones. "You'll have what you need," he said. Howard Pearson let out a long, slow breath. Ellen McAllister said, "Good," with a finality that closed that portion of the conversation like a door. They spent another hour mapping the remaining steps. Pemberton would draft the formal complaint to the territorial authorities. Marsh would provide the bank's documentation under a confidentiality arrangement that protected the institution while supplying the evidentiary record. Okafor would speak to his father-in-law about the County Records Board's procedures for removal of an appointed official under investigation. Each family present would submit a signed affidavit confirming the details of their individual contact with Graves or other cult intermediaries. It was, as Thomas said quietly to Abigail on the walk to the wagon afterward, more than they had come in expecting to accomplish. "We came in hoping Marsh wasn't Colt's man," Thomas said. "We're leaving with a case." "We're leaving with the beginning of a case," Abigail said. "There's a difference. Don't let the morning make it feel more complete than it is." Thomas looked at her. "You're not relieved. I will be relieved when Alderman is removed from that office and the documentation is in a judge's hands," she said. "Right now I'm thinking about what Colt does when he finds out the meeting happened." She was right to think about it. The information reached Colt, or reached Calhoun, who reached Colt faster than she had hoped. She could not determine afterward exactly how it traveled. Whether through the boarding house where Marsh had stayed or through one of the dozen small channels through which information leaked in small Montana communities, despite everyone's best efforts. It didn't matter, ultimately, how the information moved. What mattered was what Colt did with it. He moved. Not Calhoun this time. Not Graves. Not an intermediary of any description. Warren Colt came himself. He arrived at the Whitaker Ranch on a Wednesday 11 days after the McAllister meeting, driving his own wagon without announcement. Abigail was in the kitchen when she heard the wheels on the gravel, and she looked out and saw a man she recognized from description rather than acquaintance compact, well-dressed, perhaps 60. With the contained physical presence of someone who has spent decades getting what he wanted through means that rarely required physical force. She watched him climb down from the wagon. She watched him look at the ranch with the assessing expression of a man looking at something he still intends to own. Then she watched him come toward the main house. She dried her hands. She went to the door before he knocked. He stopped when she opened it. He had expected she could see to be received by Thomas. His expression recalibrated in the single beat of a second, not with the dismissal that Graves or Forsyth's group had shown, but with the focused attention of a man who has done his research and knows exactly who is standing in front of him. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Colt," she said. That surprised him. That she knew his name, that she said it without preface, that she stood in doorway with the self-possession of someone who had been expecting this conversation for weeks and had already decided how it would go. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Whitaker and I make decisions together," Abigail said. "I'll get him, but anything you say to him, you can say in front of me." That's how this ranch operates. A beat. "Of course," Colt said. She brought Thomas and they sat in the main room, Colt on one side, Thomas and Abigail on the other, with the particular geometry of a conversation in which the sides have already been drawn and everyone knows it. Colt did not bring papers. He had not come to make an offer. He had come to read them. Abigail understood to sit in the room and determine how serious the threat was, how organized the opposition had become, whether there was still a weak point he could find and apply pressure to. He opened with pleasantries that nobody in the room believed were pleasantries. And then he said, with the directness of a man who has decided the indirect approach has run its course, "I understand there have been some meetings recently concerning land interests in this county." "There have," Thomas said. "I also understand there may be some misapprehensions about my business activities in the area." Colt looked at Abigail. "I'd like the opportunity to clear those up if there are concerns." "Your man Calhoun sat at our table in July," Abigail said. "He came with a group that claimed to be cattle buyers. He documented the negotiation and reported the details of our operation, including the debt situation, back to you. Those details then formed the basis for Harold Graves's land offer in August. I don't think those are misapprehensions, Mr. Colt. I think those are facts." Colt's expression did not change. That was, she thought, The most revealing thing about him, the complete steadiness, the absolute absence of the involuntary, tells that most people produce when they're caught in something. He had done this long enough that surprise had been trained out of him. That's a serious set of allegations, he said. It's a serious set of documented facts, Abigail said, which are currently being reviewed by a lawyer and supported by bank records and the testimony of 7 property-holding families in this county who were approached by your intermediaries with access to their private financial information. Colt was quiet for a moment. In that moment, Abigail watched something shift in the room, the particular and absolute change that happens when a negotiation that one party has been winning recognizes that the other party has caught up. "What do you want?" Colt said. "Not what do you think you have, not this won't hold up, not I'll have my lawyers contact yours." He said, "What do you want?" which was the question of a man who has decided the pragmatic move is to find out the terms before the formal mechanism closes around him. It was, she realized, a concession, not an admission he would never give her an admission. But he had just confirmed with that question that he believed she had enough. "I want Frederick Alderman removed from the county land recorder's office," Abigail said. "I want the payments to his intermediary company in Helena stopped and the records of those payments provided to the appropriate territorial authority. I want a written undertaking from you that no further approach direct or through intermediaries will be made to any property holder in this county regarding land currently under dispute or under the terms of any coalition agreement." Colt looked at Thomas and Mr. Whitaker. "She speaks for this ranch," Thomas said. "I'll add one thing. The Hendricks family. They took 60 cents on the dollar for land that was worth more. We'd like to see that addressed." For the first time, something moved behind Colt's eyes. Not guilt. She did not think guilt was an emotion Colt spent much time with, but the recognition of a variable he had not expected to encounter. The Hendricks transaction had been clean, legal, accomplished, and he had not imagined it would be brought back into the room. The Hendricks sale was completed legally, he said. The Hendricks sale was completed under manufactured financial pressure, using information obtained illegally, Abigail said. That's a different thing. The legality of the final transaction doesn't cover the process that produced it. Pemberton has the documentation. He'll be the judge of what it covers. Colt said nothing. "Think about what costs more," Abigail said. "Addressing the Hendricks situation privately, or having it become part of a territorial investigation that examines your entire 14 months of activity in this county. You're a businessman. I imagine you can do that calculation." The silence stretched. Then Warren Colt did something she had not anticipated. He looked at her, not at Thomas, at her, and said, with a precision that she recognized as reluctant respect, "You've been very thorough." "I've had good teachers," she said. "Mainly men who underestimated what I was paying attention to." Colt left an hour later with no agreement signed but with the understanding, communicated in the particular language of men who make deals through implication rather than declaration, that the terms she had laid out were under serious consideration. Pemberton would handle the formal documentation. Marsh would cooperate with the territorial office. The alderman situation was already in motion through James Okafor's father-in-law and the county records board. When the wagon disappeared down the road, Dale Hutchins appeared from the direction of the barn where he had been, Abigail suspected, within earshot the entire time. "He's going to cooperate," Dale said. "He's going to calculate that cooperation is cheaper than exposure," Abigail said. "Which comes to the same thing." Dale looked at her with the expression she had seen developing in him over the past several weeks, not admiration, exactly. Because Dale Hutchins was not a man who performed admiration, but something more valuable than admiration. Something closer to the steady, unadorned recognition of a skilled person by another skilled person who has finally understood what they're looking at. "The men were wrong about you," he said. "I was wrong about you." "You weren't entirely wrong," Abigail said. "I am a cook. I'm just other things, too." Dale almost smiled. "Yeah. I'm starting to understand that." She went back to the kitchen. 3 weeks later, Frederick Alderman resigned from the county land recorder's office under pressure from the county board, effective immediately. The announcement came through on a Tuesday in a letter from James Okafor, who had attended the board meeting and reported in the careful handwriting of a man making sure every word was accurate that the resignation had been accepted and that a review of the office's records over the preceding 24 months had been initiated. The following Thursday, Pemberton wrote from Billings to say that Territorial Authority had received the formal complaint and had opened an investigation that named, among other parties of interest, a Billings-based business entity with established ties to a land acquisition operation in the Yellowstone corridor. He did not name Colt directly. The legal process had its own language and its own timeline. But Abigail read between the lines with the ease of someone who had spent months learning exactly what those lines contained. Thomas received the Hendricks resolution, notice 10 days after that. It came in the form of a letter from a Helena law office, not from Colt. Never from Colt directly informing Thomas that an anonymous benefactor had purchased the contested land parcel and intended to offer the Hendricks family right of first refusal to repurchase at the original sale price. The legal construction was elaborate and careful, and designed to appear as though no connection existed between the anonymous benefactor and any named party in any ongoing investigation. Ellen McAllister, when Abigail told her, laughed outright for the first time since Abigail had met her. "He paid to get his own name out of it," Ellen said. "He paid to limit his exposure," Abigail said. "The Hendricks family gets their land back either way." "It's not justice." "No," Abigail agreed. "But it's a better outcome than they had 2 months ago." "I'll take the better outcome while the formal process works on the justice." Ellen looked at her, across the table, with the direct appraisal she had applied since the first meeting. "You're not done," she said. It was not a question. "I'm not done," Abigail confirmed. "But this part is." She said it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has managed a complex fire, kept it exactly where she needed it, fed it carefully, controlled the heat, and produced from the process something that would have seemed impossible to the men who had underestimated what she was doing in the kitchen. The ranch debts were manageable now. The cattle sale from Forsyth's group had covered the most urgent obligations, and Thomas had used the breathing room to restructure the remaining loan with Marsh, directly a conversation that Marsh had been notably cooperative in. Perhaps influenced by the awareness that Thomas's partner had his institution's confidential records sitting in a leather satchel and had chosen to use them constructively. The herd had a reputation now. Word moved in cattle country through the channels that mattered, buyers talking to buyers, brokers comparing notes, and the story of the woman who had demonstrated the quality of Whitaker beef to a roomful of skeptical purchasers had traveled those channels in the particular way that useful professional information travels efficiently, with a great deal of interest. 3 new buyers had inquired about the spring sale. Abigail had replied to all 3 personally, with letters that were as precisely written as the one she had sent to Obadiah Marsh. She signed them all: Abigail Carter, partner, Whitaker Ranch and Cattle Operation. She was still signing them when Thomas came into the kitchen one evening, in November, when the first real cold had settled over the Montana grassland and the windows were fogged with the warmth from the cookstove. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, in the particular way he had developed of announcing his presence without interrupting whatever she was doing. She set down her pen. "What is it?" she said. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, his habitual seat now, the chair that had become the chair he sat in when he had something real to say. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read over the course of this extraordinary autumn. Not the look of an employer addressing a competent employee, not the look of a grateful man performing gratitude, but the look of a person who has been changed by proximity to another person and is still in the process of understanding exactly how the change has worked. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." He took a breath. "When all of this is finished, the investigation, the alderman situation, The formal documentation. I don't want things to go back to what they were. Not the structure, not the arrangement, not the... He stopped and started again. I don't want you to be the partner in the room when buyers come and the cook in the kitchen the rest of the time. I want it to be real. All of it. All the time. Abigail looked at him. It's already in writing, Thomas. The partnership is in writing, he said. I mean something else. She held his gaze. I'd like to know, Thomas said carefully. Whether the woman I've been sitting at this table with for the past 4 months, the woman who saved this ranch and built a coalition out of nothing and wrote a letter to a banker that changed the direction of everything, whether that woman would consider a different kind of conversation. When the legal business is settled and the dust has cleared, and we can both think straight. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the Montana wind moved across the grass in the dark. Ask me again, she said finally, when the dust has cleared. He nodded. He didn't push it further, which was exactly right, because Thomas Whitaker was a man who understood that the right timing mattered as much as the right question. He stood to leave. Thomas, she said. He turned. The answer, she said, is going to be yes. I just want you to ask it properly. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. Not the relief of a man whose proposition has been accepted, but the quieter, more complex expression of someone who has been given something he was not sure he deserved, and who intends from this point forward to be worthy of it. He left the kitchen. Abigail picked up her pen and finished the last letter. Outside, the wind moved across the Montana grass, and inside the kitchen the stove was warm. And somewhere in Billings, a territorial investigation was building itself from the evidence in a leather satchel. And 7 families along the Yellowstone River corridor were sleeping more soundly than they had in 18 months. It was not over, but it was turning. And the woman sitting at that kitchen table, pen in hand, signing her name to letters that were changing the shape of things, she was the reason it was turning. She had known that for a while. Now, finally, so did everyone else. The territorial investigation concluded on a Friday in early March of 1885. Abigail learned of it the way she had learned most things over the preceding 8 months, through a letter, this one from Pemberton, written in his dry, economical hand and containing more satisfaction between the lines than the words themselves admitted. Frederick Alderman had accepted a formal settlement that included a permanent bar from public office in the territory and the repayment of documented payments received from Colt's intermediary entity. The Helena business entity had been dissolved. The territorial authority had closed the formal investigation with findings that, while stopping short of criminal charges against Warren Colt, personally he had been, as men like Colt always were, sufficiently insulated from the mechanisms he'd employed, made explicit the pattern of coordinated financial manipulation that had targeted property holders along the Yellowstone corridor. It was not everything she had wanted. She had wanted Colt named directly. She had wanted something that would follow him into the next county, and the one after that. Something with enough weight that men in clean coats with pocket watches would think twice before sending the next graves through the next gate of the next struggling rancher. What she got was less than that, and more than nothing, which was the nature of most real victories, messier than the clean resolution you had planned for, more durable than the thing you had feared you'd settle for. She read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in the leather satchel with the rest of the documentation, and she made breakfast for 30 men, because the work didn't stop for victory any more than it stopped for anything else. Thomas found her at the stove an hour later. Pemberton's letter, she said, before he could ask. It's on the desk. She heard him cross the room, heard the paper open, heard the particular silence of a man reading something that cost him less than he had feared. It's over, he said. The investigation is over, she said. Colt is still out there. Abigail. She set down the spoon and turned. Thomas was standing with the letter in his hand and an expression on his face that was not complicated. It was one of the simplest expressions she had ever seen on him, which was perhaps why it stopped her. Thomas Whitaker was a man of layered reactions. A man who processed things slowly and completely and rarely showed the processing. But standing in that kitchen on a March morning with Pemberton's letter in his hand, he looked like someone who has just set down a very heavy thing and is feeling the particular unfamiliar lightness of not carrying it anymore. "It's over enough," he said. "Let it be over enough." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked the spoon back up. "Ask me your question," she said. He set the letter down on the desk. He came to the kitchen table, his chair, the one that had become his by accumulation of mornings and evenings, and the long conversations that had rebuilt this ranch from the inside, and he sat down. He did not fidget. He was not a man who fidgeted. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the same steadiness he had brought to every hard conversation since July. "Abigail Carter," he said, "will you marry me?" Not a question quite. More the way you state a thing you have been certain of for long enough that the uncertainty has worn away entirely, leaving only the declaration. She finished stirring what she was stirring. She set the spoon down. She turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms folded, which was a posture she had been told was too direct for a woman, and which she had never once modified on that account. "I told you the answer was going to be yes," she said. "I know what you told me," Thomas said. "I'm asking properly." She looked at him across the kitchen. 8 months. She had come from the kitchen window to the yard, to the fire, to the dining room table, to the fence line, to Ellen McAllister's dining room, to the room where Warren Colt had finally understood that she was not going away. And through all of it, Thomas Whitaker had moved with her, not always at her speed, not always with her certainty, but consistently, without retreat. He had signed the paper. He had sat at every table she had organized. He had said she speaks for this ranch when it would have been easier to say something more qualified, and the unqualified nature of it had mattered every single time. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He nodded, once the nod of a man receiving a thing he had not taken for granted even when he hoped for it. He did not make a performance of the moment. He stood up from the table, came to where she was standing, and held out his hand. She took it. They stood like that in the kitchen for a moment, not dramatically, not with the theater of people performing an important occasion, but with the plain and solid reality of two people who have built something together and have decided the building should continue. Then Thomas said, "The hands are going to have opinions." "The hands always have opinions," Abigail said. "Dale's going to say it's about time," Thomas said. She raised an eyebrow. "You talked to Dale." Thomas had the grace to look slightly caught. "I may have mentioned I was planning to ask. And," he said, and I am quoting directly, "took you long enough, you damn fool." Abigail laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she didn't produce often, and that transformed her face when it came. Thomas watched it with the expression of a man who has just discovered something he intends to spend the rest of his life pursuing. "All right," she said, and she turned back to the stove because the breakfast was going to burn if she didn't, and 30 men were going to be hungry in 20 minutes, regardless of what had just happened at the kitchen table. "Tell the hands at supper. Not before. I want to get through the morning without opinions." She got through the morning. She did not get through supper without opinions, but the opinions were, with the notable exception of one younger hand who seemed more bewildered than opposed and came around by the end of the week, considerably warmer than she had allowed herself to expect. Dale Hutchins, when Thomas made the announcement at the supper table, said nothing for a moment. He looked at Abigail across the table with the direct, unornamented regard that was his natural mode of respect, the look of a man who does not say more than he means and means what he says. "Good," he said. Then he went back to his plate. It was from Dale, approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The wedding was in April, a practical ceremony at the Kellam Church officiated by the minister, who had known Thomas for 20 years and who managed, despite obvious curiosity about the entire situation, to perform his professional duties without editorializing. Ellen McAllister stood with Abigail. Howard Pearson stood with Thomas. James Okafor and his wife attended from the neighboring property, and Clara Duval came from town. And Margaret Holt cried with the uninhibited generosity of a woman who had always felt herself to be slightly central to whatever was happening, and was not wrong about it in this case, having been the one to name Warren Colt at a kitchen table in October. Abigail wore her best dress. She did not have a dress made for the occasion, because there was work to be done and a spring cattle sale to prepare for, and the ranch did not stop running because its co-owner was getting married. She wore the navy wool she had bought in Billings 2 winters before, which was well made and suited her, and she pinned her hair with more care than usual. And when she walked into that church on a clear April morning in 1885, she walked in with the unhurried self-possession of a woman who is exactly where she intends to be. The spring sale changed everything in ways that the autumn had only begun to suggest. Word had traveled over the winter through the channels that moved cattle information buyers, talking to buyers, brokers comparing notes, the professional network of men who made their living assessing livestock and who were, when they found something worth noting, thorough about noting it. The story of the Whitaker demonstration had moved with the particular efficiency of useful information, a woman who understood beef at a level that had shamed professional assessors, who had turned a $40 per head offer into a $90 per head sale by cooking 25 steaks and letting the quality speak. Buyers came to the spring sale who had not come before. Not just from Billings, from buyers who operated at a scale that made even Forsyth's operation look like a preliminary negotiation. They came with more respect in their advance communications than Thomas had been accustomed to receiving, and the respect was addressed in several letters, not to Thomas Whitaker alone, but to Thomas and Abigail Whitaker, which was a small thing and also not a small thing at all. Abigail ran the demonstration for the spring sale with the same precision she had applied to every subsequent demonstration since July, but with refinements she had developed over 8 months of thinking carefully about what worked and why. She had expanded the cooking from a single meal to a structured tasting, which sounded more formal than it was in practice. She selected 3 different cuts from 3 different sections of the herd, prepared each one in the way that best expressed its particular quality, and she presented them in a sequence that told a story not about cooking, but about the land and the animals and the consistent care that produced what was in front of you. She did not cook alone anymore. She had taught 2 of the ranch hands the basic principles not to replace herself, but because having other people competent in the demonstration made it clear that the quality was not a one-time event, not a trick, not a single exceptional meal from a single exceptional cook, but a reproducible standard that was built into the operation. That distinction mattered to buyers. She had learned over the preceding months that what buyers feared more than poor quality was inconsistency, the gamble of excellent beef today and ordinary beef tomorrow. Demonstrating that the standard was systemic rather than personal changed the nature of the purchase from a bet to an investment. The spring sale numbers were nearly double the autumn sale. Thomas read the final figures at the kitchen table on a May evening with an expression that moved through several phases before settling into something she couldn't name precisely, not disbelief, because he had watched every step of the process, and nothing about the outcome was mysterious, but perhaps the recognition of a man who had spent so long managing decline that expansion felt foreign, like a language he was learning to speak again after years of disuse. "We paid off the Billings loan," he said. "I know," Abigail said. She had been tracking the numbers since February. He looked at the figures again. "We have capital, actual operating capital, enough to buy the Morrison parcel if it comes available." The Morrison parcel was 40 acres adjacent to the north pasture that Thomas had mentioned wanting, in a distant and theoretical way, twice in the previous year. It would expand the grazing range significantly and strengthen the position of the herd going into the next season. "Put in an inquiry," Abigail said. "Don't wait for it to come to market. Go directly to Morrison and find out what he'd consider." Thomas looked up. "You think he'd sell privately?" "I think Morrison has 2 sons who want to go to Denver and a daughter in Billings, And no one at home who wants the land, Abigail said. I think he's 63 years old, and the winter was hard. And a private inquiry from a neighbor who wants to pay fairly for a parcel that would otherwise have to go through the land office is exactly the kind of offer that gets considered seriously. She paused. I think you should ask me how I know that. Thomas put the papers down. How do you know that? Clara Duvall's sister is married to Morrison's neighbor, Abigail said. I've been paying attention. Thomas stared at her for a moment. Then he said, with a quality in his voice that was becoming its own kind of ordinary between them, What would I do without you? You'd manage, she said, but the cattle would be worth considerably less. He laughed. He had been laughing more since March, a fact she had noted with the same observational precision she brought to everything else, and which she chose not to remark on because some things were better simply noticed than discussed. She wrote to Morrison the following week. He responded within 10 days. By the end of May, the 40 acres were in the process of being transferred, at a price that was fair to both parties and that required none of the pressure or manipulation that Colt had built his operation on. It was a straightforward transaction between neighbors who understood what each other needed. It felt, she thought, like the opposite of everything Colt had represented. Simple, clear, honest. The way transactions between people should work, when the people involved are not trying to take something from each other. The Hendricks family returned to their land in June. She heard about it from Howard Pearson, who had heard it from James Okafor, who had been present when the paperwork was completed at the county recorder's office, the office now run by a methodical, careful woman named Ruth Stanton, who had been appointed by the county board after Alderman's resignation, and who had, within her first 3 months, implemented record-keeping procedures that made the kind of information leakage Alderman had facilitated structurally impossible. Ruth Stanton had come to Abigail, before her appointment was confirmed, to ask for advice on the procedures. Abigail had spent 2 hours with her at that kitchen table, going through what she knew about how the information had been accessed and transmitted, and Ruth had listened, with the focused attention of a professional, being briefed. And at the end she had said, You should have been a lawyer. And Abigail had said, I've been something more useful, and Ruth had laughed and agreed. The Hendricks family, old Martin Hendricks and his wife and their daughter, who had never stopped believing they would get the land back, drove back onto their property on a June morning and began the work of rebuilding. Abigail heard, through the network that now carried information more deliberately and more carefully than it once had, that Martin Hendricks had stood at his fence and wept. She allowed herself, in the privacy of her own kitchen on the evening she heard that, to feel the full weight of what that meant. Not pride. Exactly, pride was too simple a word for a feeling that contained that much history and that much effort and the particular satisfaction of having done something right that nobody asked you to do, that nobody expected you to do, that the world had organized itself specifically to prevent you from doing. She felt it, completely, and then she went back to work, because that was also who she was. In the autumn of 1885, 1 year, almost exactly, from the September morning when Warren Colt had come to the Whitaker Ranch and left having understood, for the first time, that the woman in the kitchen was not an obstacle to be removed, but a force that had already outmaneuvered him, Gerald Forsythe returned to Montana. He came this time with advance notice. He wrote a letter 3 weeks before his arrival, addressed to Thomas and Abigail Whitaker jointly, expressing interest in the spring herd and requesting the opportunity to discuss purchasing terms in advance of the sale season. He signed it respectfully. Abigail read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and sat with it for a moment, the specific quiet moment of a person who has traveled a long distance and has turned to look back at where they started. 1 year ago, Gerald Forsythe had stood at her fence with his pocket watch and his professional certainty and his offer of $40 a head, and she had been the cook, standing at the kitchen window. The large woman in the apron that nobody thought to consult about the value of anything. She picked up her pen and wrote back. She told him they would be happy to receive him. She told him the demonstration this year would include 4 cuts instead of 3, reflecting the expanded herd and the refinements she had made to their assessment process. She told him the terms of discussion would include a first consideration arrangement for buyers who committed early, and that the details of that arrangement could be reviewed when he arrived. She signed it, Abigail Whitaker. Forsyth arrived on a Tuesday in October with 2 associates she had not seen before, not Calhoun, who had not been seen in the county since the spring, and whose absence nobody had commented on publicly, and everyone had noted privately, and he came differently than he had come the first time. He came with the particular altered bearing of a man who has revised his understanding of a situation and adjusted his approach accordingly. He shook Thomas's hand. Then he turned to Abigail and shook her hand and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, it's good to see you again, Mr. Forsyth," she said. "Come in." The demonstration that year ran 3 hours. She had refined it further, the sequence of cuts, the explanation she offered as each one was tasted, the connection she drew between what was on the plate and what was in the pasture, and what that meant for the consistency a buyer could expect season over season. It was not just a meal anymore. It was a presentation as organized and as persuasive as any business case she had seen made at any table. And it was built on the foundation of 11 years of knowledge and 8 months of practice, and the specific quality of beef produced on land she had come to understand as well as any person alive. Forsyth's 2 associates ate in the focused silence of men encountering something they had not expected and were recalibrating around. Forsyth ate the last cut and set his fork down and looked at Abigail across the table with an expression that was uncomplicated and not young, the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know when he has been wrong about something. Significant, and who has arrived, late, at the willingness to say so. "I underestimated what you had here," he said. "Last year when I came, I underestimated it." "Yes," Abigail said. "You did. You could have been more gracious about it," he said, and there was a dry quality to it that she recognized as the closest this particular man could come to humor. "I could have," she agreed, "but I've found that being accurate serves us both better than being gracious." He nodded slowly. "The price per head this spring. You'll want to commit before January if you want the first consideration rate," Abigail said. After January, the terms change. He committed before he left that afternoon. Standing on the porch, watching Forsyth's wagon move down the road toward Kellam, Dale Hutchins came to stand beside her. He had been at the demonstration, always present now, part of the structure of how the ranch received buyers, his steady foreman's presence communicating something that the food and the figures could not communicate alone. He looked different, Dale said. "People change how they look at things when the things turn out to be different from what they assumed," Abigail said. Dale was quiet for a moment. "The Morrison parcel. I've been looking at the north fence line. If we run it another 100 yards east, then we can put 20 more head in that pasture without crowding," Abigail said. Dale looked at her. "I was going to work up to that conclusion." "I know. I got there faster." He shook his head, but the head shaking had the quality it had been developing for months, not the exasperation of a man struggling with something he resented, but the particular affectionate impatience of someone who has accepted, genuinely and completely, that the person they're dealing with is simply faster on certain things and has stopped finding that threatening. "I'll look at the fencing tomorrow," he said. "I'll have the figures on the additional head capacity by Friday," she said. "We can take it to Thomas together." She went back inside. Thomas was at the desk, going over the commitment numbers from Forsyth's visit. He looked up when she came in, and the look he gave her was the one she had come to understand as simply the way he looked at her now, not with the wonder of a man still surprised by who she was, but with the settled recognition of someone who knows exactly what they have and has stopped being astonished by it because the knowing has become part of how he moves through the world. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. Forsyth committed. He did. Thomas leaned back in the chair and looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what we talked about last winter. About expanding the demonstration program. making it something other ranchers could learn from. Abigail had been thinking about this too. The coalition that had formed around the cult situation had held beyond the immediate crisis, not as a formal organization, but as a network of people who were now in regular communication and who trusted each other with information in ways they hadn't before. Several of the coalition families had come to her over the summer, asking about the demonstration process, about how she assessed quality, about the principles she had developed for presenting beef to buyers. She had answered all of them, because knowledge kept private was not knowledge serving its purpose. There's a way to do it, she said, not just for the ranches in the coalition. Something more structured, a standard that cattle operations in this territory could apply, that would lift the baseline quality of what buyers encounter when they come to Montana and change how they price the whole region's product. Thomas was looking at her with the expression of a man who has asked a question and received the answer that the question deserved rather than the answer he expected. "That's considerably larger than what I was thinking," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's what makes sense." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you'd need partners. Other ranchers who've already seen what the demonstration does for their sale prices." "I'd need Howard Pearson and Ellen McAllister and James Okafor," she said. "I'd need a meeting. I'd need probably 2 months of planning before anything formal takes shape." "When do you want to start?" "I'll write the letters tomorrow," she said. She said it the way she said everything she had decided, without preface, without apology, without the qualifying uncertainty that the world had spent years trying to press into her. She said it the way the woman who had crossed the gravel yard and spoken to Gerald Forsythe at the fence said things directly, from the center of her own certain knowledge of what she was worth and what she was capable of and what she intended to do with both. Thomas nodded. She sat down at the desk and pulled out a sheet of paper and picked up her pen. Outside, the Montana autumn was turning the grass the color of old gold, and the cattle moved across the pastures in the late afternoon light, in the slow, deliberate way of animals that are fed well and managed carefully on land that understands them. The north fence line ran clean to the Morrison parcel. The herd was the strongest it had been in 10 years. The letters from buyers were stacked on the corner of the desk in a pile that was thicker than anything Thomas Whitaker had accumulated in the 5 years before she walked out of his kitchen and told a man at the fence that he was wrong. Abigail Whitaker set the pen to the paper. She had not become powerful because someone gave her power. She had not been discovered, rescued, elevated by another person's grace. She had walked into the room she was supposed to wait outside of, and she had spoken with the knowledge she had accumulated in 11 years of being underestimated, and she had not stopped speaking when the room pushed back. And she had not stopped when the pushback organized itself into something more dangerous than dismissal. She had built from a kitchen table and a cast iron skillet and a mind that the world had spent decades trying to convince her was not worth listening to, something that would outlast the argument about her worth. The argument was over, not because the world had decided to agree with her, because she had made the disagreement irrelevant. She wrote the first letter. She signed it with the name she had always had, the name that was now written on a partnership deed and a marriage certificate and buyer commitments, and a coalition agreement and a letter sitting in a territorial authority's files. The name that had traveled from a kitchen window in July to everywhere it had reached by October, the name that was going to be on the letters she would write tomorrow, and the ones after that, and the ones that would. She had decided. Change the standard of what Montana cattle were worth on every market that mattered. Abigail Whitaker. She had always known what she was worth. Now the world was learning to keep up.